A very good afternoon. You're watching NDTV's very special show on Pope Francis' funeral. Remember, Pope Francis passed away recently at the age of 88, and today is when the funeral of Pope Francis will take place. I'm Gauri Dwivedi, and over the course of the next 60 minutes, we'll tell you why this is the biggest global event, and we at NDTV will keep giving you the very latest on it. On your screens right now, viewers, are those latest visuals that are coming in. Global leaders, monarchs, heads of states, all are there in Vatican to pay their last respects to Pope Francis. From India, President Murmu is also there. And on your screens, as I said, are some of those heads of state, monarchs, global leaders, all there to pay homage to Pope Francis, who recently passed away at the age of 88. The world bids farewell to a pope who was more progressive than some of his predecessors, a man who wanted to address some of the challenges that the papacy faces, a man who was very keen to also look at what best can be done to address some of the larger civilizational issues that the world is dealing with. The Pope was also at the forefront of issues related to immigration, issues related to women's rights, and what best he could do to address them. It is said that while it is impossible for a single Pope to change doctrine, but it is possible for a Pope to address the issues with the same doctrine through a personalized approach. And that's exactly what Pope Francis achieved. He became Pope after his predecessor decided to not pursue. At the age of 85, in 2013, he became the Pope. And since then, he has led Vatican, led the Catholic Church in addressing, as I said, some of the core fundamental issues the world is facing, immigration being one of them. He wanted to address poverty. He wanted to ensure that the Catholic Church stood for the poorest of poor and those who stood at the last of the line. Let's also now get in some updates and, in fact, reporters joining us on ground to give a sense of what lies ahead, what would be the course of the next 3 hours. In fact, this entire ceremony is likely to stretch for about 4 to 5 hours. We will talk about that. Ollie is standing by from Vatican City to talk to us about what can we expect. The ceremony is supposed to start, Ollie, very shortly. We are playing those visuals on our screens. Talk to us about the solemn occasion, the lakhs of people who are there right now to see the Pope for the very last time, and what can we expect from the ceremony that will start in about 90 minutes from now.
That's right, the ceremony getting underway now, and just before it we've seen, for example, President Donald Trump and the UK's Prince William, along with Prime Minister Keir Starmer, paying tribute at the Pope's coffin before the service got underway. Dozens of dignitaries from all over the world are there, but also tens of thousands of other mourners in Rome and around Vatican City too. Police have just told us in the last few minutes that they believe around 140,000 mourners have made their way to the Vatican for the funeral service. It's 80 or so pages long. It is very much a Catholic funeral service that will be very familiar to Catholics all over the world. It is slightly pared back at the wish of Pope Francis himself, as are many of the events that are going to unfold over the coming hours. His coffin is also less ornate than some previous popes, and after the funeral service has taken place, he actually won't be buried at the Vatican like popes have been for the last 100 years or so. The coffin will move through the streets of Rome to a nearby Santa Maria Maggiore venue, which is a church that the Pope visited 100 or so times during his papacy. He was very fond of it. He often prayed there, and that's where he has chosen to be buried. And the route that the coffin procession will take through the streets of Rome, it's not very far, but that will also be lined by tens of thousands of mourners who've come out to pay their final respects as the Pope moves towards his final resting place.
And the fact that Pope Francis' last wish was that he wanted to be buried not in St. Peter's Square, but not in the St. Peter's Basilica, but at the other basilica you mentioned in Rome. It also pretty much is in line with what his papal legacy was, which is that he did not want to stand for pomp and protocol as much as some of his predecessors.
That's right, and that's reflected throughout today as well. For example, we're told that there will be some prisoners in attendance at the funeral service, and that was a recurring theme during his papacy. He often met with prisoners here in Rome and would wash their feet, and spent his whole papacy trying to make sure that he was pursuing the interests of ordinary people and ordinary Catholics all over the world, working on issues related to vulnerable people as well. He made a lot of pronouncements, for example, related to migrants and immigration, a key issue here in Italy, but also in other countries around the world. Francis was known throughout his career as being a person who forewent the trappings that would normally come with his office. Even back in Argentina, he was well known for cooking his own meals and taking public transport. Here at the Vatican, he took on a modest apartment in the Vatican rather than the palatial accommodation that he would be entitled to as Pope. So that was something he was well known for as a Jesuit in the Catholic Church throughout his papacy and his career before that, and as I say, reflected in the hours ahead as well.
Ollie Barrett, stay with me. I know you're reporting live from Vatican City. I want to come back to the fact that he was the Jesuit Pope and what it meant, what was his outlook as compared to his predecessor. But I want to play out this important package as we at NDTV pay homage to Pope Francis. Let's play out this report, and then, Ollie, I come back and talk to you more about the papal legacy that Pope Francis has left.
A spiritual giant is no more. Pope Francis, the leader of the Roman Catholic Church, has died at the age of 88.
Carissimi fratelli e sorelle, con profondo dolore devo annunciare la morte del nostro Santo Padre Francesco.
Born Jorge Mario Bergoglio in Buenos Aires, Argentina, Pope Francis had many firsts attached to his name. The first Jesuit Pope, the first from the Southern Hemisphere, and possibly the first Pope to have an inclusive stance on homosexuality.
Se una persona è gay e cerca il Signore e ha buona volontà, ma chi sono io per giudicarla?
That now iconic phrase, "Who am I to judge?" became a testament to his desire to bring back people to the church, no matter their background. His progressive views came to the fore once again in 2015 when he urged the world to take climate change seriously and protect what he called our common home. With his message always grounded in dialogue, peace, and human dignity, he reached out to Muslims, Jews, atheists, and even those estranged from the church. Though his health declined for the worse this year, Pope Francis continued to lead with resilience. In one of his last public appearances, just hours before his death, he appealed for global peace.
Fratelli e sorelle.
His papacy will be remembered not just for his revolutionary views, but also for how deeply he cared for people from all walks of life. Bureau Report, NDTV World.
Indeed, and in fact, the two things that Pope Francis talked about at several occasions, the two issues that he felt very deeply about was climate change, and the other, of course, being around the fact that what best can be done to make the papacy that much more inclusive. And Ollie, I want to ask you on that front, which is, he mentioned about climate change more than once. That was an issue that was very close to his heart, along with, of course, embracing homosexuals. The comments that he made really meant that the church had moved forward in the single Pope's tenure, the Church had moved forward maybe by a century.
That's right, he wasn't afraid to speak out on issues like that. Now, that's not uncontroversial within and without of the Church, and when Donald Trump is here sitting at the funeral, which is now underway, you wonder how he reflects on some of those issues on which he clearly had different views from Pope Francis, who made some critical comments about the US administration with regards to immigration. Also, as you say, different views on climate change as well. When it comes to the Church itself, again, some divisions on some of those issues. You mentioned the Pope's pronouncements during his papacy on issues around same-sex unions and homosexuality, for example. Some in the Church welcomed those comments and welcomed the direction he seemed to be moving the Catholic Church on that particular issue. Other traditionalists, conservatives in the Church, actually had anxiety about the direction of travel on that issue, and that will take us into some of the conversations about the next Pope and the conclave to choose who succeeds Pope Francis. And some conservative cardinals will potentially be looking to appoint a Pope to succeed Pope Francis who takes a slightly different stance on issues around same-sex unions, for example, than Pope Francis did. Other liberals in the Church will be hoping to appoint a cardinal who can continue his legacy in that regard. But as you quite rightly say, Pope Francis absolutely making a point throughout his papacy on speaking publicly on issues around homosexuality, on climate change, on immigration, on the way the refugees are treated around the world. That was very much a key part of his papacy from many of his supporters within the Church.
Indeed. And I'm now going to zoom out and also tell our viewers, why is this such a big global event? Why does this matter to the entire world, and why are there world leaders paying homage here to Pope Francis? Simply because that is extremely important to understand the context in which Catholic Church works. Some of the issues that when the Pope takes an opinion on has a global impact, whether it is immigration, whether it is civilizational issues that he's spoken about, whether it is about embracing Christians and other religions as well. All that has an impact in terms of a global message, isn't it, Ollie? And that's something that we need to focus more on and talk more about.
Very much so. Part of that is just simply because the Catholic Church is such a huge institution worldwide. There are something around 1.5 billion Catholics in different parts of the world. Obviously, Catholicism incredibly strong here in Europe, but also on the African continent, in parts of Asia, in the Americas as well. So the Pope, whoever it is at any given time, is the spiritual leader of a good chunk of the global population. And therefore, when the Pope makes pronouncements around moral or political issues, it is something that global leaders have to listen to, even if they don't necessarily agree with what the Pope is saying at any time. And that takes us back to some of the clear disagreements that Pope Francis had with the Trump administration, for example. When J.D. Vance, the US Vice President, visited with Pope Francis and his aides just before Pope Francis passed away, it was made clear by the Vatican that the Pope and those around him had expressed views which are critical of US stances on things like immigration. And so whether or not it has necessarily a huge impact on the policy of some of those governments and leaders that the Pope and the papacy and the Vatican may have disagreements with, it is something that they certainly have to listen to, because their constituents, their electorate, will be partly made up of Catholic voters.
Absolutely. Ollie Barrett, really appreciate you joining us live from Vatican City on the biggest global story that we are keeping a very close watch on. Viewers, on your screens are the latest visuals coming in of the funeral ceremony that's currently underway of Pope Francis. Global leaders, monarchs, heads of state are paying their last respects to a man, as Holly was pointing out, was often at odds with world leaders, Donald Trump being one of them, who's arrived at the Vatican, and he's there with his wife, Melania Trump, along with other global leaders. Now, why is this such an important issue, viewers? Because the global, when the Pope speaks on issues, when the Vatican Church takes an opinion on some of these issues, it has a global message there. When Pope Francis spoke about climate change, it was in disagreement with what President Trump's latest measures were. But that is what the whole point, the messaging was. Whether it was immigration, another issue that is now a larger, almost a civilizational issue, given how much it's impacting Europe as well as America. Before we go any further, let's amp up the audio, let's listen in, and let's just listen into what the latest ceremony is underway. All right, let's now get in David Willey. He's a former BBC Vatican reporter joining us live to talk more about the significance of this ceremony, the impact, and of course, what lies ahead. David, really appreciate you joining us live on NDTV. Let me start by asking you what, according to you, was one of the biggest contributions of Pope Francis to the Vatican Church and, of course, to humanity?
Well, I think he changed the mindset in the Vatican. Previously, there had been an accent on the Vatican's teaching, the traditional teaching of the Catholic Church. And of course, the Church over this past 50 years has, since the Second Vatican Council, tried to give a new, more positive picture of its teaching, and above all, to attract people in the global South to practice the faith. And I think what Pope Francis has done is to make the dialogue easier. He has continued the practice of foreign travel of his predecessors. He traveled all over the world, and I was a member of the Vatican Press Corps for no fewer than 3 different popes. Pope John Paul II, Pope Benedict, and then Pope Francis. And this was a wonderful way in which he managed to get to what he called the periphery of the Church. He was interested in people living marginal lives, poor people, not the wealthy and the famous and the heads of state who are gathered together here today for his funeral, but ordinary Catholics. And I think he paid particular attention also to countries which don't have a large Catholic population, particularly in Asia. And there's even talk here that the next Pope could well be an Asian, which would be a really big news.
Indeed. And in terms of now, also the ceremony per se that is underway right now, it is expected to last about 5 hours. Talk to us about the next steps and the final journey of Pope Francis, and also the significance that he has chosen to not be buried in St. Peter's Basilica.
Indeed, he expressed the desire before he died to be buried in one of the great Rome basilicas called Santa Maria Maggiore, where he often used to go and pray. It's another break with tradition, a typical break with tradition, excuse me, because previously most of his ancestors are buried in the crypt of St. Peter's, but he chose to be different. And I think this again is another sign for the future. Well, what will happen here, there's about another 2 hours to go before the end of this ceremony. And then there'll be a long procession, a cortege through the streets of Rome, during which the Pope's coffin will be taken at walking pace through the center of the city, which is very clogged at the moment because this is called a holy year in Rome. It's a jubilee year. We've got loads of pilgrims, as well as Catholic pilgrims, as well as many tourists here. Accommodation has been at a premium. It's very difficult to find a whole hotel room within 30 miles of Rome at the moment. And this procession will take at least another hour. And then a small group of faithful and people and close collaborators of the Pope will attend the actual burial ceremony inside the basilica. They've set aside a niche in the wall of the basilica, and it's a very simple tomb. It's made out of stone from Liguria, which he particularly had an affection for. That's the area in northern Italy where his grandparents were born, because of course he also came from a migrant family. And he will have on his tomb just one word, Franciscus, Francis in Italian, the name by which he chose to be taken, the name of St. Francis of Assisi, of whom he was a great admirer. And I think that it'll be very interesting to see whether a future pope is also going to be known as...
I was going to come to just that, David, that after this, while 80% of the cardinals who are going to be voting in the conclave have been chosen by Pope Francis, while it may be very easy to assume that maybe they would also like a progressive pope, but that's let's not make that assumption. But the fact is, whoever succeeds Pope Francis will probably have to carry some bit of this legacy forward, right? Where he's chosen to be more inclusive, he's chosen to let go of pomp and protocol in view and embrace people, and that is something that the next Pope will probably have to carry forward. Or do you think the next Pope can also just start from scratch and it doesn't need to be a carry forward of this kind of legacy?
Oh no, there's no starting from scratch. I think this Pope's legacy will be very great, and the fact that most of the cardinals who will elect his successor, in fact, were chosen by him. Over 100 out of the 135 cardinals who will vote and decide on the name of his successor, they were all his appointees. So these, I think, can all most likely are people who want to take a forward-looking attitude and don't really appreciate the attitude taken by some of a minority of the cardinals who are described as traditionalist, who would like to see the church return, as it were, to its roots. It's a very interesting institution, the Roman Catholic Church, because it thinks, of course, not like politicians, all who are gathered here today in serried ranks, the world leaders, kings, queens, presidents, heads of heads of government from more than 130 different countries, all in front of the Pope here today. They are, in the main, preoccupied by political considerations. The Church looks beyond the politics towards the morals, and it looks aghast at a world which is spoiled by war, by the problems of poverty,
yes,
by the problems of existence. And I think the Church is going to deal with the nitty-gritty, as it always has done, but even in a greater and more close sense.
Indeed. And in fact, David, stay with us, because I want to play out this report about what really are the steps that are taken or that need to be taken to now choose the successor of Pope Francis. Let's play out this report. We come back and continue our rolling coverage of this big global story. Choosing a new pope is an elaborate affair. Once the last rites of the pope is completed, the College of Cardinals is tasked with electing the new leader. The college consists of cardinals who are bishops and archbishops. In theory, any Roman Catholic man who has been baptized can be considered for election to become pope. The cardinals, however, prefer to select one of their own. Voting happens inside a guarded environment, and the interaction of cardinals from the outer world is restricted to remove the chances of collusion of votes. A two-thirds majority has to be achieved. Currently, there are about 140 cardinals who are eligible to vote, with each cardinal voting through a ballot paper. No one can get inside the Sistine Chapel during this selection process. One gets to know the result through the smoke that comes out from the Vatican's rooftop. If a pope hasn't been chosen, the ballots will be burnt along with a chemical that makes the smoke black. White smoke indicates the selection of the new head of Roman Catholics. Within 30 to 60 minutes of the release of white smoke, the newly elected pope appears on the balcony overlooking the St. Peter's Square, signaling a new chapter in the history of the Vatican. Bureau Report for NDTV World. Welcome to a very special broadcast of Pope Francis' funeral, where heads of state, monarchs, global leaders are all congregated to pay their last homage to Pope Francis, who's making his last journey today. On your screens, viewers, are those latest visuals coming in. The ceremony has started and will see Pope Francis being buried not at the St. Peter's Basilica, but instead in Rome, in a clear message and in line with what his papal legacy has been all about. Less about pomp and protocol, more about embracing humanity, more about the contribution that he was making, and was passionate about the causes that he embraced. Let's quickly now get in Ollie Barrett, who's been standing by at Vatican City to give us all the very latest that's unfolding right now. Ollie, talk to us about the proceedings that are underway, what all is likely to happen, to understand the process and the entire ceremony in detail.
That's right. The Dean of the College of Cardinals, 91-year-old, leading the ceremony. Before the service began, the Pope's coffin was sealed, and before that, tributes were paid to it in person by US President Donald Trump, Prince William of the UK, along with the Prime Minister Keir Starmer and others. And the service is 80 or so pages long. We expect it to last an hour and a half to 2 or perhaps more hours, depending on how quickly they move through it. A recurring theme in the service is resurrection. Now, that would always be the case in a Catholic Requiem Mass like this, but it is even more evident in this particular service, which was put together by Pope Francis himself in conjunction with his Vatican aides. And the theme of resurrection considered to be particularly appropriate, not least because Pope Francis wanted it to be, but also, of course, because he died over the Easter weekend, dying on the morning of Easter Monday. And then when this service concludes at the Vatican, the Pope's coffin will actually be taken away from the Vatican to its final resting place just down the road outside the Vatican in Rome.
Yes, indeed. All heads of state, dignitaries, global leaders are there paying their last respects. Talk to us about the significance of not choosing St. Peter's Basilica, the message that it sends in terms of the final message, rather, of Pope Francis' legacy and, of course, his uniting message to the world.
Yes, the Santa Maria Maggiore resting place that he has chosen was a very special place to Pope Francis. It means that he's the first pope not to be buried in the Vatican for over 100 years, but he used to visit the Santa Maria Maggiore church repeatedly during his papacy to pray. He went there, we think, over 100 times during the period in which he was pope, but also before that, when he was living here in Rome and working at the Vatican. It is partly because he was so devoted, Pope Francis, to the Virgin Mary. And that's one of the reasons he wanted to be buried there. He will have a simple casket, more simple than previous popes, and a more simple tomb as well, simply with the word Franciscus on it, the Latin for Francis, again reflecting the way that Pope Francis carried out his papacy, devoted. He would want us to remember him more to the people around the world and Catholics around the world than necessarily to the trappings of the papacy. And that's one of the things that many of the Catholics gathered here in Rome today have been remarking on when they are telling us how they will be remembering Pope Francis and his papacy.
Indeed. And also, there have been about lakhs and lakhs of mourners who are gathered at St. Peter's Square in the last 24 hours. Have you been able to speak to anyone in terms of what they thought was the biggest contribution of Pope Francis, how Pope Francis changed their life, his thoughts, his beliefs, how that shaped their views and their religious beliefs?
Absolutely. Catholics have come from all over Rome, all over Italy, all over the world to be here. And many of them have been telling their personal stories about exactly why they wanted to do so. It may be that some had met him previously. It may be that some felt touched by things that he said during his papacy, things that he did during his papacy. And as you say, many of the Catholics that are gathered here in Rome do talk about the fact that they feel Francis represented them and their issues, their problems, their needs and their feelings and their spirituality. Now, he wasn't universally popular within the Catholic Church. There were some traditionalists, conservatives, who felt that he was in slightly the wrong place on a number of issues around homosexuality, for example, same-sex unions. Some conservative American Catholics felt that he was too sharply critical of the United States when it comes to immigration, for example. But for the thousands of Catholics gathered here in Rome, many of them, as you quite rightly say, have personal stories and reasons to be here. And in terms of the number of them, the Vatican says that over the preceding days, over 250,000 people filed through St. Peter's Square to view Pope Francis's casket. And at the beginning of the funeral service today, police here in Rome are saying that they think there were around 140,000 people gathered in and around the Vatican for the service itself.
Indeed. Ollie, stay with me because I want to quickly play out this report that has been filed by Soli Salgado on the funeral proceedings that are underway. We come back and continue this very important conversation.
I am here in St. Peter's Square where hundreds of thousands of Catholics, pilgrims, world leaders and dignitaries have gathered for the funeral of Pope Francis. Another large contingent of people are gathered at the Basilica of St. Mary Major, where he will ultimately be laid to rest. Those of you in India might recall that in September of 2024, Pope Francis embarked on a historic 11-day trip to the Pacific Asia region. This was the longest trip and the most complex of his entire papacy. His stops included Singapore, Timor-Leste, Papua New Guinea, and Indonesia, which was notable because it's the world's largest Muslim majority country. A few of those gathered here have told the National Catholic Reporter that they originally came for the canonization of Carlos Acutis, the first millennial saint, during what was intended to be the Jubilee for teenagers. So there is a large swath of young people gathered for the funeral today, which is fitting for a pope whose legacy will largely be remembered for opening the church doors to all. This included listening directly to the people by hosting a number of synods during his papacy, aiming to bring the church to meet the people where they are and listening to their concerns and trying to be practical about church teaching. He published an encyclical on the environment. He uplifted women and Catholic sisters in leadership roles at the Vatican. And importantly, with matters of sex abuse in the church, he worked toward accountability and transparency. He is the first Latin American Pope, the first Pope of the Americans, and the first Pope of the Global South, which is where Catholicism is most alive. Whether or not the Church will stay the course and try to follow Francis's legacy with his successor will remain to be seen in the coming weeks. But today, we honor the memory and work of Pope Francis.
All right, let me go back to Ollie Barrett, who's with me from Vatican City. Ollie, the one thing I want to ask you about is the fact that how much of a difference did Pope Francis' papacy make to ensuring that women have more say, more representation as far as the Catholic Church is concerned? Talk to us about that. There, I think a lot of people have said that the contribution of Pope Francis has been remarkable.
Yeah, many female Catholics would say that he made great progress in that area and that they feel it is now a more inclusive church. Now, there are also women Catholics who say that they wish the church was moving more quickly in that area, and perhaps some of them also will say that Pope Francis should have made moves towards female priests in the Catholic Church at some point more quickly than he did. That's not, of course, what conservative Christian traditional Catholics would believe, and it's just one illustration of the difficult balance that the Pope and the Church have to strike on a series of issues, and that the next Pope will also have to grapple with as well. But I think whether they necessarily agree with the positioning of Pope Francis or not, most Catholics will tell you that he did make the Church more inclusive during the time that he was in office, with his words as well as his deeds.
Only the other thing I want to ask is that after this ceremony today is the period of period of mourning that will take place, and then of course the overall selection that will start with the conclave that will take place at the Sistine Chapel. Explain to our viewers what that process is all about from here after the ceremony.
Yeah, that process is about choosing the next Pope, effectively, and you have over 100 cardinals from all around the world who have come to the Vatican, who have come to Rome for the funeral, but also for that conclave, which will start around May the 5th or 6th. And the conclave is essentially the cardinals talking to each other, discussing who they believe should be the next Pope, and also praying on the issue. And that happens at the Sistine Chapel. They are effectively cut off from the outside world. They won't be therefore influenced by people's chatterings on social media or on television or in the newspapers. The idea is that the cardinals can get together and can pray together, discuss together, and come to a view on who the next Pope should be. Once 2/3 of them agree on that, then the next Pope will be chosen. How long that takes is impossible to say. The last couple of rounds of choosing a new Pope have taken 2 days or so. It could be shorter than that. If the cardinals coalesce around one candidate more quickly, it could take longer than that as well. In terms of who's going to be the next Pope, there are a number of names that have been mentioned in the frame, but an old Italian saying will tell you that if you enter the conclave as a Pope, you tend to leave as a cardinal. And what that saying means is that it's very rarely the so-called favourite going into the conclave that actually ends up being chosen as the next Pope.
Indeed. And in fact, as we talk about the next process here, on your screens, viewers, are some of those important highlights of Pope Francis' legacy, the fact that he allowed same-sex couples to be blessed, and of course the gay marriages took longer, but the fact that he said that homosexuals must be given and must be blessed as well is an important fact. He also reopened the debate when it came to female deacons. That's another very important aspect of of his legacy, and he restricted traditional Latin Mass as well. Remember, he was a man who stood less for protocol, more for ensuring that the Catholic Church was able to connect more with the people. And of course, climate change, an issue that was very close to his heart. And I think one of the reasons why he clashed with the Trump administration early on was because of climate change. The fact that Trump administration decided to exit the climate accord, the Paris Accord, and so on and so forth, led to the first set of clashes, ideological disagreements between Pope Francis and Donald Trump and his administration. Ollie, let me ask you on that front, the ideological issues that he stood for, the issues that he championed, the causes that were close to his heart, climate change, immigration, the fact that he wanted to be more inclusive. Do you expect that to be carried forward, whoever will be the successor of Pope Francis?
Well, it's very hard to say because of how the conclave works, and what many have predicted is that because Pope Francis himself appointed many of the cardinals who will make the decision, some experts and analysts have said that makes it likely that the next candidate will be someone who carries on the legacy of Pope Francis, that thinks in the same way that he did on those issues that you mentioned. Now, the opposite could also be true. It could be that some of the conservative traditionalists in the church rally together to actually try and pick a candidate who can perhaps move the church back towards some of the traditional positions that they would like to see preserved for the future. So it's very difficult to say in that regard. It could go one way or the other. You mentioned some of the issues that Pope Francis spoke out about during his time as Pope, and those include conflicts around the world. He spoke regularly about the conflict in Gaza. He spoke regularly about the conflict in Ukraine and wanting peace in both of those locations. And on that note, we are told by Ukraine that President Zelensky, who is here, and US President Donald Trump, who is also here, have met before the service took place. We don't know exactly what they discussed, whether there were any particular outcomes, positive or negative, of those discussions, but we are told by Ukraine that Volodymyr Zelensky and Donald Trump have had a meeting before the service took place. And although this is a day for a funeral, it is also a day when diplomacy is going to be happening. And clearly, when it comes to the United States and Ukraine, it's a day that diplomacy is already happening.
Ollie Barrett, thank you so much for joining me from Vatican City. Viewers, if you're tuning in right now, we are rolling special show right now, rolling coverage of Pope Francis' funeral. On your screens are those visuals. Let's play them full for our viewers to see what's really happening right now in Vatican. Leaders from 170 countries have congregated to pay their last respects, final respects to Pope Francis. The ceremony is underway, being led by Cardinal on your screens right now. And then what will happen is very unusual. Pope Francis' last wish was that he should not be buried in St. Peter's Basilica. Instead, he has chosen, and his request was that he should be buried in Santa Maria Maggiore Basilica in Rome, where the coffin will be taken to, and the tomb will also be, the tombstone will also be very simple. Simple ceremony, simple tombstone for a man who stood for simplified papacy rather than a lot of pomp and show and a lot of protocol. He wore white robe instead of the red robe. He did not want to wear those red shoes because he wanted his legacy to be a departure from his predecessors. But what happens next is something that hasn't changed for 800 years, viewers. And I'm going to get David Valley to talk more on that, which is the next steps. For 800 years, this has been the process that the Catholic Church has followed to choose the next Pope, to elect the next Pope, which is going to now be through, of course, the Cardinals meeting at the conclave at the Sistine Chapel, and that is when the world will know who follows Pope Francis. I want to ask you first, David, about the fact that Pope Francis was a Jesuit. How much of an impact did that have on his outlook, on his worldview? And do you think that is now going to shape papacy, irrespective of who comes after Pope Francis as the next leader of the Catholic Church?
Yes, I think that the background of Pope Francis is going to affect the future of the Catholic Church simply because most of the cardinals who will be choosing his successor were chosen by him. Clearly, what he has changed is to appoint cardinals from all over the world. Previously, it was above all Europeans and above all Italians who controlled the church. Now, the field has been thrown wide open, and they're even talking about an Asian pope for the first time. Clearly, it's unlikely that you'll get a pope from a country like Japan, for example, which has less than half of 1% of a Catholic population. The favorite clearly would be the Philippines, which is very, very Catholic. It's something like 80% of Filipinos are Catholic, for reasons unconnected with the Philippines, because it's a relic of colonialism by Spain, the fact that it used to be a Spanish colony. But I think that it would have been in Francis's vision that the church leadership should shift around the world. And of course, there has also been the idea mooted that we should have our first black pope, an African pope. The problem with the Africans is that they tend to be more traditionalist.
Pope as an African pope?
I think it's pretty unlikely myself.
It is unlikely. Okay, but I want to also tell our viewers that what David was mentioning, that the cardinals will come essentially from 4 different corners of Earth, from Philippines, East Timor, to all the way South America, and of course Europe as well. So covering all 4 corners of Earth to come together to decide who will be the next leader of the Catholic Church. But as we are talking, where will that leader come from? Given the fact that concerns and challenges and issues that need to be addressed are everything from immigration to climate change, to some of them are civilizational, some of them are also about taking the legacy of Pope Francis forward, and the ultimate clash that Catholic Church faces, which is the fine line between progressives and the ones who want to, of course, hold on to tradition and are more conservative in their approach. And David, let me ask you this quickly, which is that there are, of course, 80% of the cardinals are chosen by Pope Francis, but is that an indicator that the next Pope may actually be more progressive? Or do you think there's more than what meets the eye here, and we'll have to wait and see how that process unfolds?
It all depends on what you mean by progressive, because of course the church would argue, the church leaders would argue that already they've made a lot of changes since the Second Vatican Council, which was back in 1962, which was regarded as a great reform. When, for example, the Latin Mass was abandoned in favor of the Mass being said in different languages. Although you'll notice this morning this particular Requiem Mass for the Pope, the funeral Mass, is being celebrated not only in Latin but also in many other languages as well. So I think another idea which is going to be circulating among the cardinals is perhaps we need a Pope who speaks fluent English. His predecessor, Pope Benedict from Germany, spoke fairly good English. John Paul II, who reigned here in Rome for 25 years, and who I had the honor of accompanying on many of his foreign travels, including to India, didn't really speak at all very well. And I think that a Filipino cardinal, for example, is the name of Cardinal Tagle, who works here in Rome at the Vatican, has been mentioned, who speaks 7 different languages. That would be an immense asset to the Church in putting out its message, because clearly in the modern world, leaders both political and religious, need to be able to express themselves to as wide an audience as possible.
Right.
And that will be a consideration, I think.
That's a very important point you've made, sir, which is that the Catholic Church will have to also look into the fact that who would be best placed to communicate the message of Catholic Church to the world. And that could be, it's not a deciding factor, but of course a very important aspect. Thank you so much, David Wiley, for joining me live to understand what could be the next process and why what we are seeing right now is going to be that much important for world politics and, of course, also the intersection of culture and as well as religion and politics. On your screens are those live visuals that are coming in from Vatican, where the ceremony is underway of Pope Francis. Final tributes being poured in. 170 plus heads of state and global leaders are there. 170 plus countries are being represented. There are over 2 lakh mourners who are there to see Pope Francis for the final time before he's laid to rest and buried in a very simple ceremony with a very simple tombstone, not in Vatican, not in St. Peter's Basilica like his predecessors, but in Rome, sending a message that this was a pope and this was a papal legacy that was about embracing the common man and standing for the last man in the queue.
Invitando alla ragionevolezza, invitando all'onesta trattativa per trovare le soluzioni possibili. Perché
we at NDTV have also paid our tributes to Pope Francis. Take a look.
A spiritual giant is no more. Pope Francis, the leader of the Roman Catholic Church, has died at the age of 88.
Carissimi fratelli e sorelle, con profondo dolore devo annunciare la morte del nostro Santo Padre Francesco.
Born Jorge Mario Bergoglio in Buenos Aires, Argentina, Pope Francis had many firsts attached to his name. The first Jesuit pope, the first from the Southern Hemisphere, and possibly the first pope to have an inclusive stance on homosexuality.
Se una persona è gay e cerca il Signore e ha buona volontà, ma chi sono io per giudicarla?
That now iconic phrase, "Who am I to judge?" became a testament to his desire to bring back people to the church, no matter their background. His progressive views came to the fore once again in 2015 when he urged the world to take climate change seriously and protect what he called our common home. With his message always grounded in dialogue, peace, and human dignity, he reached out to Muslims, Jews, atheists, and even those estranged from the church. Though his health declined for the worse this year, Pope Francis continued to lead with resilience. In one of his last public appearances, just hours before his death, he appealed for global peace.
Fratelli e sorelle.
His papacy will be remembered not just for his revolutionary views, but also for how deeply he cared for people from all walks of life. Bureau Report, NDTV World.
With that, we come to an end this very special broadcast. Thank you so much for watching. We slip into a break. We come back with more news and updates on the other side.